suppose I normally read people like Ronan Lyons or Dan O'Brien, and I'm very impressed by some of the discussions I've had here this morning. So I have to say from start, I have no idea why I was picked to do this. I almost feel like doing an anti-Hillary, like when they start high, go low. So we just wait and see how it goes. Sean asked me to do a presentation on the concept of an insecure island and what that might entail. And that's, don't mean to put the frighteners on you, Discovery Channel does that enough. But just giving it some thought. Modernity, modern society, the one we're living in at the moment, has become quite concerned with the issue of safety and risk. The phrase risk society is well discussed by the sociologists at this stage. And you have to wonder why that has happened. I mean, technology is complex, there are so many uncertainties. I suppose one of the threads to connecting this to some of the discussions earlier this morning, business hates uncertainty. And one of the key tasks we have to do is we as a nation have to do, is to minimize the uncertainties that business might anticipate or might experience, and see how, not necessarily solving all problems, but at least reduce the risks that would happen to many of the assets that we've heard spoken about this morning. I mean, we've seen, I don't know anybody who reads the papers here, every second week there's Russian jets flying off the west coast of Ireland. The Latvians and the Poles are mobilizing with the Americans. It's an age of uncertainty. Not as uncertain as listening to the radio this morning, some people were discussing about the 1980s, when we had similar experiences of hard times and a state of chassis in Europe. So I suppose just reading on to that, we look at the issue of language and culture, where we're coming from and what are the things that we might need to define before we start talking about risk. And risk is well established, it's a discipline at this stage, it's not something airy-fairy, quite a specialised discipline indeed. In Ireland, when you look at the idea of national risk, there's a huge transition is or has taken place from the initial concept of civil defence, the group of people in blue uniforms who turned out to direct traffic when they're going to the Curragh races. Fine. But that's not what civil defence is. Yet we're transiting to a concept of civil security, driven by, of course, Europe and European policies. Civil security is something different and raises a few question marks in Irish heads. There's a terminology to the background of risk, dealing with precise definitions of hazard, threat, impact, trends, risk, vulnerability, etc. If it's a science, if it's a discipline, it needs certainty. Apology for the slight formatting fallout. We also need to deal with or be aware of what our own experiences of risk are, and as a community, how we perceive it. The technological aspect or the technological view is probability by impact equals risk. We know that. We know it as economists, we know it as financial managers, we know it as business managers, and we know it across health and safety. But the community perception is, oh God, something bad will happen. They look at Discovery Channel, they read The Independent, they read the Irish Times, and it's a perception which they have which is not quantified. So the issue of trust and communication comes into play. And as a paradox, we're never more closely guarded than we are these days, and yet we're never feeling more insecure. And we're never more closely regulated, but we are never more distrustful of things that are happening around us. And that issue of trust is one of those key factors that keeps coming up in the fundamental role of leadership is to build trust. The fundamental aspect of social capital is trust. So why do we launch into this idea of disaster risk reduction and its drive towards preparedness, good governance, and education? Managing risk in our current society is becoming a ubiquitous task. It's about protecting people, infrastructure, investment, and the normal functioning of society. It started long ago, not just this year or last year. UN General Assembly during the 1980s and 90s in its development drive, looked to reducing the experience of disaster impacts on vulnerable and emerging economies. You had the Yokohama Strategy for a Safer World, and during the 90s, the Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. Natural disaster. The end of the 90s, 1999, the UN General Assembly thought progress was good, and they established a permanent secretariat to support the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, ISDR. That led to the convening of a world conference, the framing of the Hyogo framework for building the resilience of nations, helping nation states, particularly the vulnerable nation states, cope with impacts of natural disasters. Again, that had some progress, some missed targets, but it led on to the development of the Sendai framework. All of these places, they're attached to Japanese cities, Japanese experiences. Japan has led the issue of disaster risk reduction very successfully. Sendai was selected because of its experience in the earthquake, which had just preceded that, I suppose, the World Conference. But the Sendai framework spoke about disaster risk reduction, risk assessment, risk governance, a huge issue of being able to manage the processes, not just of what happens when it happens, but managing the lead up, minimizing the effect, and the preparedness issues of Build Back Better. It culminated in that Sendai framework, and it's only just over the last couple of months, couple of weeks indeed, been fully endorsed and ratified by all the UN nations. It wasn't just a matter of natural disaster, but disasters are being seen now as man-made. Ban Ki-moon, when he visited the Philippines after the super typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda, was very clear in stating that this was not a natural disaster. We have to see these disasters now as being man-made because of climate change. World Food Programme sees many of the disasters in West Africa, in Asia, even indeed in Central America, where there are food insecurities. One of the basic securities that confronts a community, that in many cases food insecurity, famine, is caused by mankind, be it conflict or be it other actions. So in practice, how did the UN deliver that? And I'm just drawing a little bit on my own experience. In issues of preparedness, for example, looking at doing things like, very effectively, long-range assessments, logistics capacity assessments, food security analysis, risk assessments generally. For rapid response, having permanent facilities, permanent resources, people, material, transportation mechanisms immediately on standby, building the resilience of the receiving nations, particularly building institutions and their capacity to adapt and manage the resources which are being made or placed at their disposal. The one UN concept, and the UN is criticizable for many, many things, but it does recognize its own failures. Trying to establish a coherence through development assistance programs. The Rome-based agencies in particular have taken a lead in developing services like long-range weather forecasting. WFP's long-range weather forecasting was one of the first agencies to identify the beginnings of the last El Niño cycle. Food security and leading the development around that and putting the things in place, putting the logistics in place to get food to market. Because in many cases, for example, crisis of food security are not a lack of food. Food doesn't get to market. And of course, the Cameron government was very committed to the idea of evaluating its aid programs. And one of the things that it did do, working with WFP and UNICEF, was to evaluate its donations to infrastructure development as a key issue to disaster risk reduction. And they identified that the larger the piece of infrastructure, the more expensive, not just the more expensive, the larger the piece of infrastructure, which they spent a lot of money on, the greater the return on investment, up to 7 times its initial investment. That's a significant return which justifies the idea of investing in not just overseas aid and development, but also investing in infrastructure. There are a number of world practices at the moment which take global risk assessments forward. Apart from UNSDIR, which does the Global Risk Report, GAR, and it's all web-based, two organizations that readily publish on a routine basis and have been used. One is the UN University based in Tokyo, aligned with the University of Stuttgart in Germany. They produce what they call the World Risk Report, and they theme it. They take issues like health or food security, or this year they've taken logistics, as an issue of key development or key offsets to disaster which may occur. Logistics would something which might well have good relevance for Ireland as well. Interestingly, they rank Ireland 112th of the world's nations, Italy 119. Why? We've all been reading the newspapers about the series of earthquakes. It's about exposure. We're exposed to Atlantic storms and bad weather, but our capacity to adapt and manage that is is quite strong. Italy, despite its recurring experience of earthquakes, is adjudged to have very significant capacity to adapt to and respond to that, despite the fact that they have, they can have an earthquake with 300 casualties. Their national response to coping with that is very strong, hence their low rating. The Global Risk Assessment is published by the World Economic Forum. We did, when we were working with World Food Programme, we had some limited input into how they developed that issue. But it is a robust document, very technical, very comprehensive in the way it addresses risks, trends, interconnectedness, resilience. So it's not something that somebody just made up out of their head, but they do base their categorization of risk on the basis of a survey of 700 and odd members of the World Economic Forum who are companies. So the one caveat you need to be aware of when reading that document is it is a risk assessment of business from a business perspective, and not necessarily adaptable to being a risk assessment applicable to a nation state. So in Europe, how has Europe addressed this? In Europe, the Civil Protection Mechanism was established in 2001 and is now embedded in the Treaty of the European Union for the functioning of the European Union under Article 196. And it gives the Commission and the European Union the mandate to go about civil protection. Now, it initially started under the Director General of ECHO, DG ECHO, which is the European Community's Humanitarian Office. Its focus initially was overseas, but not restricted to that in its formalization. It was linked to, or is linked to, very clearly, the internal security strategy of 2010. And this is where things begin to go a little bit wobbly from an Irish perspective. Our understanding of what internal security is it being a policing matter. The European view of what internal security is a civil society issue. Anything that affects the well-being of a nation, of communities, that's internal security. It focused on a number of broad issues: international crime, terrorism, radicalization, cybersecurity, border management, and resilience to crisis and disasters. All of these issues are current, and we can see how they are being influenced on a day-by-day basis. It took an all-hazards approach and established a very formal guidelines for risk assessment, a staff working paper which was circulated or published and provides a solid basis for preparing national risk assessments. I suppose the other issue is the so-called solidarity clause, which has quite often been implemented. For example, during this year, you would have seen that Portugal experienced quite a number of wildfires. Portugal activated the solidarity clause. The European Union deployed firefighting aircraft, made it available for a number of day period, which helped it deal with that particular issue. That experience, particularly of wildfires, has been common across most southern European or Mediterranean areas. One provocative, let's say, call it provocative, from an Irish perspective, implementation of the Solidarity Clause was in relation to the aftermath of the Bataclan massacre, where France called on European nation states to assist it in its fight against terrorism. We begin to wander into that non-spoken issue of Irish neutrality and non-alignment. So it's something that you need to be aware of in the background when thinking in terms about national risk assessments and internal security strategy. It's a debate for another day. The European Union has also published directives on floods, environment, critical infrastructure, money laundering and terrorist financing, all of which Ireland has taken on board and has published policy documents or risk assessments in those particular areas. Quite good documents. And then lastly, the European Union has taken the tasks of the Sendai framework and has only this summer published a comprehensive risk assessment and mapping requirements under the, just one issue, under the Sendai tasks, including the development of training for and the governance capacity of European nations. In Ireland, what are we looking at? I did mention earlier on, we're transiting from a civil defence perspective to a civil protection perspective. The government task force and the Office of Emergency Planning at very high level give overall policy guidance. National and regional steering groups and working groups provide the, let's say, the doing arm, the operational arm of the overall framework of emergency kind of response and civil protection. That devolves down to lead departments, the main departments, and pardon me, I'm going to shortcut here, it's not the Department of Housing, but you know what I mean, Housing, Health, Justice, Defence and Transport. Those are the lead agencies where in the event of a particular type or category of event would take the lead in determining whether to implement and how to implement the national framework for emergency management. The primary responders, of course, the principal responding agencies are the local authorities, Gardaí and the Health Services Executive.
5 minutes.
Okay. Oh, Christ almighty. We are, of course, we have a number of civil society organisations, volunteers, mainly with expertise, Red Cross, and we'd say Mountain Rescue, etc. There are a couple of outliers. Nobody knows quite where they fit in. Department of Taoiseach, Department of Communications, Department of Finance, and of course Public Expenditure, who manage the money. Briefly, I'm going to summarise this very quickly. Civil protection, civil defence is laid down in the framework for emergency management, and a little bit dated but still very good, a European synthesis review under the Anvil project of civil security systems in Europe. Its characteristics, we in Ireland are quite civil in nature, the way we respond, other countries aren't, predominantly voluntary, and we exhibit a very Irish solution to an Irish problem, both decentralised and centralised aspects. Our definition of what a major emergency would be, or response required would be a sudden onset event which causes death or injury. Now, that doesn't address the issue well recognised now in international circles of the slow onset crisis, and there are many of them. The National Risk Assessment flowed from the work of the Office of Emergency Planning, and it was first published in 2012. It shared, in order to try to share an understanding of societal challenges, agree basis for priorities, and comply with EU obligations. Primarily, they were looking to establish coherence, a framework with which individual agencies and government departments could hang their hat when they start doing their own risk assessments. The Department of the Taoiseach took that over in 2014 to 2016, and the last National Risk Assessment, I know you have all read it thoroughly from cover to cover, was published on the 21st of October this year. That's the National Risk Assessment for 2016. It provides a systemic overview and is pitched in, this leaves me a little bit surprised, pitched in the idea of Dáil reform without any reference to EU obligations. Identifies 5 categories of risk, drawn from the World Economic Forum business focus, but it only identifies the risks. It doesn't take the trends. It doesn't take the long-term view. It just leaves me a little bit wondering as to how appropriate that selection was. It defines risk as an uncertain event which creates significant negative impact over a 10-year period. Very nebulous definition, not something which the technician in me would want to nail down. The risk assessment does address changes since 2015. Some of them are very obvious. It provides some very good analysis, almost to the line of providing a very good basis for a solid futures outlook. Some of the risks it identifies might be critiqued as saying, are they risks at all? Under that loose definition, maybe yes. But under the classic definition of sudden onset, maybe yes, but causing casualties, you'd have to wonder, what is the national risk of tax changes evolving? Is that a policy issue or a risk issue? The risk may be, if we have an Apple and now a Google, what does that do to our reputation? Expenditure pressures and infrastructure are also issues of public policy as distinct from risk. There's the balance of consideration within the document. Some of the economic arguments and the economic concerns are extremely well debated and argued and referenced. But the issue of cybersecurity, for example, draws 2 paragraphs, 2 reasonably short paragraphs, with an emphasis on the theft of personal data. Lord knows we are watching in full view at the moment how the manipulation of electronic data can influence world events in America. How the theft, not of personal data, but of sensitive public or non-public information can be used to threaten a nation state. So what are we looking at with regard to that national risk assessment being reflected in government? It's not universally reflected in the statements of strategy of many of the government websites. There are a couple of notable exceptions. Department of Housing, Planning, Community and Local Government. Department of Foreign Affairs, very strong. Department of Defence, very strong. Precious little reference throughout the rest of those agencies and departments which would have a all-government response. Is there a basis there? Sorry, just to revert to that, following from the statements of strategy, you'd have to wonder, is it reflected in the websites? It's almost impossible to do a trawl through government websites, search in National Risk Assessment 2016, no documents available. From a point of view of establishing coherence, that's not a particularly strong start. As a basis for public education, how many of you are aware of the National Risk Assessment? Casually speaking, none of my family are. When you look at other nation states, and I picked Finland for one reason only. I don't speak German, so I couldn't look at Austria. I was looking for a country which is similar to Ireland in scale, population, GDP, non-aligned, but it's significantly bigger in landmass, I'd admit you. 10 to 11% of that landmass, of course, is covered in water. So I just looked at both Finland and Sweden, but I think Finland is a good example of how they approach their national risk assessment for 2015. Interestingly, it's done in a 3-year cycle. It's linked very closely to defence and foreign policy options. Their process is quite clear. It's collaborative. They're very specific about defining the terminology and scenario identification. It categorizes its impact in terms of casualties, economic costs, environmental issues, social impacts, including critical infrastructure and vital functions of state. What is a vital function of state? Defined by their government, it is the management of government affairs, international activity, generally defence, of course, international security, the functioning of the economy and infrastructure, income security, and the capability to function for that society. and just generally issues of society morale. Are we living in safe times? Yes, we are, but probably we don't know it. Critical infrastructure, of course, is subject to an EU directive, and they have identified what those issues are. Going on, they identify 7 scenarios of national importance and 15 scenarios of regional importance. Some of the issues that they consider to be regional importance would be national issues for us. I suppose extreme severe weather for them is pretty much passé. But as a document, it's worth comparing the national risk assessment in Finland against the national risk assessment in Ireland and saying we're not quite there yet. The overview from our perspective is that some things are well done, there are good policy backgrounds and analysis, but we're not there with regard to the detail. One of the key things within the national civil protection arena is that it lacks, almost unique in Europe, we lack a fundamental grounding in legislation. There's a couple of civil defence acts going back to 1930s, 1940s, but nothing framing the responsibilities and the authorities of various actors and players. Its critique, is it a basis for coherence in public policy? I don't think so. Is it consistent with other national and international approaches? No, it's not. Does it reflect a priority is there a reflection of the priorities within statements of strategy? No, they're not. It's incomplete. It's not drawing on the full value of external supports and examples that are there, and the EU policy frameworks are almost ignored. I have to say that in current circumstances, as the next 2 or 3 years evolve, there is, I think, a consideration for Ireland to be more closely aligned with the detail, or not even the detail, the broad thrust of European policy, so that the key issues for us, the really important issues for us, won't become diluted, as Ireland might be pointed at as not fully signing up to a European commitment. I'll skip on, just, I suppose, noting time. Just there are a couple of other issues.
You're well out.
Yeah, well, my apologies. Right, so I'm going to close off on 2 things. If we were going to do a national risk assessment, to consider the European Union is defined by the Department of Foreign Affairs as critical to Ireland's well-being. I don't think any of us at the moment are secure in the knowledge that Europe is strong. Whether it would cease to exist is a moot point. I don't think it would cease to exist. But look at what's happening among the, we'd say the Visegrad group, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary. Are those values that are pulling at the European Union consistent with what we require? And not do we want to leave, as some English newspapers would suggest we do, but do we want to take a stronger role in guiding and directing those values? And looking at how we would, that last point, looking at how we respond to the rise of extremes, is it not an extreme threat where we have groups of people, some led by politicians, some led by nations indeed, who wish to reconstruct truth in an almost Orwellian style of creating a new language, almost like freedom is slavery? Just a sample of some of the issues.